and wild moments too, self when freed from you. I do remember working in a non-profit organization quite a few years ago now, and being caught in that wonderful, stressful dynamic we find ourselves in when we're constantly volunteering to do work for which we don't have the time and quite often the energy to do. One of the great difficulties of working in any non-profit or idealistic organization is that you're constantly trying to save a portion of the world, and at the last meeting you didn't quite do it, and so there's no excuse not to volunteer either for another meeting or for the responsibilities and work that has come out of that meeting. And one of the cliched human answers to stress and overwork is to increase your speed and your velocity. And so you find yourself speeding from photocopier to fax machine to email to receptionist to mail order in an increasingly fast and self-enclosed orbit. And the great tragedy of this approach is that after a short while, you cannot recognize anything or anyone that is not traveling at the same velocity as you are. And you become a stranger to the slower, longer cycles of existence. And you find it very difficult to have compassion for anyone who is sick, who is limping in any way, who can't keep up the pace. Because you may be sending flowers on the outside, but on the inside you're going exactly the opposite way. You are afraid of stopping, and they are reminding you that there's a part of the world that does periodically stop and takes a breath before it actually moves again. You don't know who you would be if you stopped, and you become quite resentful of people who are moving slower than you in the airport, people who are older than you, people who are more vulnerable than you. There's a kind of existential impatience and lack of generosity which comes from a stressful approach to work. And in the midst of this work for the non-profit organization, I did indeed find myself one day rushing from one person to another, from one room to another, from the photocopier to the receptionist, until I found myself in the doorway of a room in which a meeting was about to start. And in a very loud voice, as people were taking their papers out of their briefcases and settling themselves in around the desk, I said, "Has anyone seen David?" And there was a moment of stunned comprehension as people looked up from their desk and saw me standing there in the doorway. And then this huge gale of laughter filled the room. And I stood there and I laughed with them, but I was absolutely humiliated at the same time because I was the only David that worked in that organization. And I was literally asking if anyone had seen me. I'd be glad to find him because I needed to talk with him, obviously, and I needed to say a few words. I stood in that doorway and suddenly I felt this absolute and total exhaustion came over me. I'd been completely humiliated, and of course that's both difficult but also very good. In the Christian tradition, in the contemplative Christian tradition, to be humiliated means to be returned to the ground of your being, literally from the word humus, which means soil. And when you are humiliated, all your fancy ideas about yourself and who you are and what you can accomplish and how you can accomplish it are shriven away suddenly in the encounter with the ground, Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, in the middle of the road of my life, I awoke in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost. And indeed, standing in that doorway, the true way was lost. Of course, I realized it had been lost for a good few months. And most of what I was doing, I didn't have the energy to do or the will to do anymore. And luckily, I lived very near to this building and walked home because I realized I couldn't do another thing that afternoon. So after I'd had a good laugh with everyone and made my excuses, I walked home and sat down in the chair in my kitchen that overlooked the waters of the Puget Sound. And luckily on the table was a bottle of red wine, which was silhouetted against the sea. I say luckily not because I immediately opened it and started drinking it, which one would be tempted to do, but because I knew that evening that I had a guest coming. And that guest was to be a very wise friend of mine, Brother David Stendhal Rest, Benedictine monk, and we would get together and read Rilke, the great German-speaking poet, in the original German and in English. Brother David was Austrian, so he would read the German side of the page, I would read the English side, and we'd drink good red wine while we did it, because the Benedictines always insist on that. When Brother David did actually appear at my door, I sat him down, put a glass of red wine into his hand, and almost in an old petitionary Catholic way, I said to him, before we could begin on the Rilke, I said, Brother David, speak to me of exhaustion. Tell me about exhaustion. It was like something out of Cahill Gibran. And he looked at me to see if I was sincere, and he said a wonderful thing, an intriguing thing to me. He said, you know, the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. And I said, the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. And I almost felt so exhausted that I couldn't finish the sentence myself. But I said, the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. I said, what is it then? And he said a wonderful thing to me. He said a life-changing thing. He said, you know, the antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. The reason you're so exhausted is that much of what you're doing you have no affection for. You're doing it because you have an abstract idea that this is what you should be doing in order to be liked. And at that time, Brother David knew that I had been working towards becoming more visible as a poet in the world, and that I was on some kind of threshold with that. And he said, you know, David, you've been ripening away, and you're ready to harvest yourself now. You're ready to harvest yourself. And if you don't, you'll rot on the vine. There's a harvest which comes, cyclically in your life, and you're at a particular harvest now, and you must bring it in. It was really an incredibly important moment in my life, because I realized, of course, I was ready for that. The reason I was so exhausted in that work was because my energies actually lay elsewhere. There was a new annunciation in my life, and I'd followed it somewhat, but then I'd given up on it. And there was a part of me that was beginning to impersonate itself, One of the first images that came to me was the image of all the people I would have to speak to in the organization in order to change my job description. But I was so moved by what Brother David said that I took it as a work, in a sense, over the next 3 months, just to talk with those people. And I slowly changed my job description until I was actually doing a work in the organization that was suited to me, and that I could do with very little willpower, and I could do well, and I could enjoy doing. But of course, as I was doing it, and I was seeing the success of all these conversations, I was saying to myself, now, if this kind of conversation will bring about a change in my job description within the organization, what's the conversation that will bring about the huge change in my job description that will bring me to my vocation as a poet? And of course, that was the underground conversation, the invisible foundation, the place where all of the outer activity stops, where all the self-necessities had no reach at all, and where a relationship with the unknown was absolutely and utterly necessary. Once I'd actually admitted that to myself, as I look back now, I realize that most of the work had been done, The real work was simply facing up to the threshold on which I found myself, to allowing myself to become exhausted with what was peripheral,